So today's video is going to go through a couple of strategies to help tenors and basses find that falsetto. If we are working through a voice change, that can be a challenging thing to do, is sometimes that falsetto goes away altogether. So there's a couple of exercises that we can do to get into that part of our range. And so really the first thing that I would do is working with a siren. And so if you think about a fire siren, just starting at the bottom of your range on an ooh, and then working your way all the way up through the top and then back down. So for instance, if you start at the bottom, back down. So going slowly through the different parts of your range and sort of taking notice of where that switch is. If that switch is there, then awesome. If not, that's okay. So it's kind of taking note of where does my voice sort of stop and then coming back down. That's a great way to practice getting into that falsetto and not really thinking about any sort of specific pitch to it. Okay. If then you can access the falsetto that way, then try to start in your falsetto, almost like a sigh. And kind of take note again of where that switch is between our falsetto and our chest voice. Now, what we don't want to have happen is dropping down like an octave or having a very big gap. So for instance, something like this. Where it drops all the way down, right? We want that switch to sort of be as small as we possibly can. So again, you didn't hear a big gap in my range as we did that, okay? So once we play around with that, I would say just exploring our vocal range and seeing if we can, again, access that falsetto. Then we start to put some pitches to it, okay? So I like to use just a slide on an ooh up and down the octave to begin with. So for instance, ooh. Again, for you right now where your range is might be a little low, and that's okay. Join in when you feel like you're at a comfortable range where you can do that sliding. But again, you want to see that you're sliding all the way up to that high note on the octave, okay? Here goes. Now in that one, you heard me go through that switch, right? And so you're at the point probably in your range, especially for you lower voices, that this is going to, if it hasn't already, switch over into that falsetto. So doing a couple more and just practicing that back and forth between the two parts of your range. And again, just playing around with that exercise and experimenting and seeing, am I taking my voice all the way up to that top note, or is it getting stuck there? And if it's getting stuck there, one of the things that we can try and do is start in that falsetto and then come back down, like we did with the sigh, right? And so now putting pitches to that as well. So if you're into that, great. If not, every day just trying to do some exercises, just ooh, 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 almost like the hoot of an owl, and seeing if you can access that part of your range. Sometimes the biggest thing that it takes is time. right? Going through this voice change, it's not something you can always rush. It's just going to take some time for our voice to develop. And sometimes there's not really a lot that we can do. But playing around, and it could change on a day-to-day basis if you're in that voice change, and that's totally all right. But experimenting, ooh, 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 with that hoot of the owl, I like to use that, and just seeing if you can access it. If you can, then using just a 5-note descending scale, and then again on an ooh, and seeing where that switch is happening, and also making sure that, again, that there's not a huge gap in the voice. All right, so let's try that. So I'm going to start up here, just a 5-note scale. So it's just going to be ooh. Okay, let's try it. And I'll go a little bit slower with the notes. Ready? And now, you heard the switch on that one, right? So the switch was on the last 2 notes. Now, what I ideally would like to have happen, and this might be an end goal. This might not work for you, depending on where you're at in your voice change, and that's okay. But if I were to do ooh, I want that switch there, right? For some of your voices, your voice may want to drop all the way down when you make that switch. So, for instance, ooh, right? The big switch where it's jumping down the octave. When that happens with a singer, I know your ear hears it, but the voice just isn't ready to bridge that gap yet. And so it just takes some practice and some exploration, right? Don't be afraid of it. Happens to all tenors and basses. It's totally fine, right? You get that switching. We talk about the voice crack. It's just going to happen for a while, and that's okay. Giving you some strategies to work through that, all right? So back to that exercise in that same spot, trying to sort of bridge that gap between that switch. So you're hearing that switch. It might be happening on a different note in your range, and that's totally fine. Going on. Now on my range, I was able to start in that middle voice on this note. That's an E above middle C. Your voice might not be working there yet. You might still be switching in that 5-note pattern, and that's totally fine. I'll do one where I start in my head voice and then switch. Here's our starting note again, and now this was all going to be in my middle voice. And again, your voice might be in a spot where it's still switching there, and that's totally fine. But sort of, again, practicing bridging that gap and going back and forth, right? Starting at the bottom, working our way up, and if we can get into that falsetto, great. Then I like to take my singers and have them start with that falsetto and then working their way down. And ideally, again, what I'd like to see is having us bridge that gap so there's no big gap in our voice, right? Now, if you're just going through or just finishing a voice change, you might have a gap there, and that's okay. What we want to do is sort of take the bottom and work that up, and then if that falsetto is there, take that top and work it down towards the bottom, and eventually those two parts of our voice are going to find each other as our voice develops. I hope this video has been helpful to you. Take some of these exercises and again, just take this time to explore what your voice is doing. Chances are it's going to change on a week-to-week, maybe even a day-to-day basis, and that's totally fine. The most important thing is that you continue to explore and to sing through this voice change, because then once you're done, you're going to come out a lot further ahead on the other side. Best of luck.